This episode is brought to you by Progressive Commercial Insurance. Business owners, meet Progressive Insurance. They make it easy to get discounts on commercial auto insurance and find coverages to grow with your business. Quote in as little as 8 minutes at progressivecommercial.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company. Coverage provided and serviced by affiliated and third-party insurers. Discounts and coverage selections not available in all states or situations.
I am so excited for this spa day. Candles lit, music on, hot tub warm and ready. And then my chronic hives come back. Again, in the middle of my spa day. What a wet blanket. Looks like another spell of itchy red skin. If you have chronic spontaneous urticaria, or CSU, there is a different treatment option. Hives during my next spa day? Not if I can help it. Learn more at treatmyhives.com.
Hi, this is Joe from Vanta. In today's digital world, compliance regulations are changing constantly, and earning customer trust has never mattered more. Vanta helps companies get compliant fast and stay secure with the most advanced AI, automation, and continuous monitoring out there. So whether you're a startup going for your first SOC 2 or ISO 27001, or a growing enterprise managing vendor risk, Vanta makes it quick, easy, and scalable. And I'm not just saying that because I work here. Get started at vanta.com.
It's been a little over a week since Prime Minister Mark Carney sat down with Alberta Premier Danielle Smith and signed the Memorandum of Understanding about the future of Alberta's energy sector. In that time, there's been a lot of confusing messages about what that MOU means, what comes next, who needs to be consulted, and where we go from here. Hello and welcome to the Full Comment Podcast. My name's Brian Lilly, your host, and today we're going to try and figure out what it does all mean. And in the second half, you'll get to hear an interview with someone who will answer a lot of questions on the First Nations part of all of this, about consultation, and specifically all about this group you keep hearing about. Coastal First Nations is really all about, the group that says they'll never allow a pipeline. Well, who are they and can they stop it? The answer to that last question is no, but more on that later. On the day when the deal was signed, there were lots of smiles, especially from Alberta Premier Danielle Smith.
Today is a great day for the people of Alberta and for all of Canada. The last 10 years have been an extremely difficult time for hundreds of thousands of Albertans and their families that directly or indirectly rely on and make their living from a strong and vibrant and growing Alberta oil and gas sector. These Albertans are mothers and fathers and young people working so hard to put food on the table, to pay for hockey and soccer fees, and to save for the down payment on their first home.
Prime Minister Mark Carney, meanwhile, was trying to walk a balancing act, trying to make it seem like, yes, he had actually given lots to Alberta, but also trying to make it seem like he hadn't given too much and definitely not a pipeline yet.
Prime Minister, are you willing to approve a pipeline even if British Columbia or affected First Nations don't agree? Would you compensate them instead?
Just to be clear, this agreement today between Alberta and the Government of Canada, it's the first step. It's an example of cooperative federalism. We're agreeing in partnership and in a spirit of trust. But what has to happen, several things have to happen before a pipeline is built. And one of those is a private sector proponent. Secondly, goes directly to your question, which is that there needs to be full partnership, including equity ownership, substantial economic benefits with First Nations in Alberta, First Nations in British Columbia, as well as agreement and substantial economic benefits for the people of British Columbia. So we look at this as the start of a process. We've created some of the necessary conditions for this to happen, but there's a lot more work to do.
And while Carney has said multiple times that this is about more than a pipeline, that's really all anyone is talking about, a pipeline and whether it will get built. There's plenty of skepticism, but I remain hopeful, as does Premier Smith.
You asked me a few months ago, do you think you should restart the conversation about building a pipeline to the BC coast? No one would have even thought that that was going to even be possible to begin the conversation, and now it's begun. And so I think that is really a measure of just how much the recalibration in the global economy and the recalibration in Canada has been over the past year.
That's a clip of Premier Danielle Smith from an interview that I conducted with her the day after the announcement. One of the things that I put to her was, a claim by critics that this deal was not really about getting a pipeline to the northwest coast, that Mark Carney really just wants to reboot Keystone XL.
The MOU very clearly talks about a 1 million barrel a day bitumen pipeline to Asian markets and the need to potentially have a tanker ban carve out if we identify
that doesn't go through Galveston, Texas?
You don't need a tanker ban carve out to go down to Galveston, Texas.
Premier Smith is convinced that this is a good deal for Alberta. So Stephen Guilbeault, who quit the Carney cabinet over it, and other climate advisors have also quit advising Carney as well. And for those staying in the fold, like Liberal MP Talib Nur Mohammed from the Lower Mainland around Vancouver, well, he's trying hard to downplay all of this. In a post on X, he said, sounded like he was trying to rewrite the MOU. Quote, any project that goes through the Major Projects Office must have BC and First Nations consent, and we will all work to ensure our BC coast is protected. None of that's actually true. There's no need for consent from BC or First Nations. Definitely that is not in the MOU. But Liberals have continued to try and say there's no private sector partner and no proposal, as if to say that, it'll always be that way. Premier Smith, meanwhile, is saying that she's working hard with the private sector to find a backer. Then, of course, there are the issues around First Nations. Prime Minister Carney did address the Assembly of First Nations and promised them a partnership.
Canada's new government is committed to working directly with you to build stronger nation-to-nation relationships. For it's only by working together that we can build stronger, more prosperous First Nations communities and a stronger, more resilient Canada. I am pleased to announce that I will host early in the new year a joint federal, provincial, territorial First Ministers meeting with First Nations.
The AFN passed a resolution calling for the MOU to be rescinded, and there was strong pipeline opposition at the meeting. Then there's this group that I mentioned earlier, the one we keep hearing about, Coastal First Nations. Sounds like a band or a collection of bands, and that's how many in the media portray this group. But the reality is, it's a Vancouver-based not-for-profit, originally started with the help of American money from foundations that oppose the oil and gas industry in Canada. And while this group does have support in some First Nations communities, they don't represent all of them, and especially not all coastal First Nations communities. And most importantly, they don't hold right or title to any of the land under discussion. There's a lot more to be said on this issue and a long way to go before anything moves forward, but that's some of what's happened. As for the Indigenous part of all this, that's what we'll get to when we come back. An interview with a former chief of an actual coastal First Nation who supports the pipeline project and now sits in the House of Commons as an MP. My discussion with Ellis Ross when we return.
The Freddy Fazbear box just dropped at Popeyes for $7.99, and it's scary good. Garlic palm tenders and cheesy bites with marinara sauce. Upgrade to the deluxe box for $12.99 and get a 20-ounce drink in a cupcake cup. Dig in before it's too late. Try the Freddy Fazbear Crunch menu, now at Popeyes. See Five Nights at Freddy's 2, only in theaters. Love that chicken from Popeyes. Limited time at participating U.S. restaurants. Prices may vary.
Deck your home with Blinds.com. DIY or let us install. Free design consultation. Free. Plus free samples and free shipping. Free.
Head to Blinds.com now for up to 50% off site-wide plus a free professional measure. Rules and restrictions may apply.
This is Tristan Hopper, the host of Canada Did What?, where we unpack the biggest, weirdest, and wildest political moments in Canadian history you thought you knew until you would really happened. Stick around at the end of the episode to hear a sample of one of our favorite episodes. If you don't want to stick around, make sure you subscribe to Canada Did What? Everywhere you get podcasts.
Ellis Ross is a member of the Haisla First Nation near Kitimat, British Columbia. He's currently sitting as a Conservative MP for Skeena-Bulkley Valley out of British Columbia. And before that, he served as the MLA for the region in the provincial legislature from 2017 to 2024. Before that, he was on his band council, even serving as chief in 2 different elections. As far back as 2006, he helped negotiate deals to bring liquefied natural gas projects to his region to help with economic development. Here's my discussion with Ellis Ross. So, Ellis, let me ask you to break apart this myth that all First Nations are opposed to resource development, that no one wants a pipeline. You and I have talked about this before, not a long time, but I don't think your views have changed on this.
No, and in fact, many First Nations are trying to find a way out of poverty, trying to find a way to get away from the Indian Act, and they'll look at anything, basically. But you're never going to get 100% consensus on anything, whether you're talking about forestry, mining, pipelines. You're not going to get it. Even my own community, that last LNG agreement that we voted on, based on 100% communication, was 92% in favor. I couldn't get that last 8%.
That's amazing. 92% in favor. I mean, to get 92% of a community to agree on anything, of any community. Can we agree on what day it is?
It took years, right? And we had a lot of oppositional groups. We had the NDP that opposed it. We had misinformation. We had all sorts of things. So we developed a fulsome communication plan to get the truth to our people.
And so that was 2011 to 2014, roughly, is when you were working on that, correct?
I actually started on the LNG files back in 2004 for the original Chevron KMLNG project. But I also worked on the forestry files and some mining files, government relation files. But it was always on the foundation of Aboriginal rights and title and economics.
Now, you said so many communities want to get away from the Indian Act. What do you mean by that? Because that was part of, when you were a councillor, when you were a chief councillor, that was part of what you wanted to do. Explain what that means for people that don't know. A lot of Canadians don't even know what, they know the Indian Act exists, but they don't know what's in it or why you'd want to get away from it.
The Indian Act is an archaic, old-fashioned act that the Canadian government instituted 100 years ago. And it basically, I shouldn't say get away from the Indian Act. I wanted to get away from the Indian Act funding. That's what I wanted to do. Because when I looked at it, a lot of the Indian Act it's not relevant. But the Indian Act funding agreements, when our people were saying that they wanted jobs, they want independence, one of the things I realized that, okay, if you want independence, then you've got to start earning your own money. You've got to get away from this Indian Act funding agreement. And Indian Act funding agreements actually fall into 5 categories based on how well you are at managing money. So if you're not managing your money very well and your funding agreement, you're not implementing very well, then you get put into the category where the federal government actually oversees every single expenditure you make. They approve it. You do tons of reporting. But the more that you manage your funding better, then you go into progressively less lenient funding structures. So that's what my band undertook. So by the end of it, we were offered the first ever 10-year block funding agreement in Canada because we showed them that we can manage money. We got out of deficit. We got out of that. But my point always was that if you need $100 to run your village, the government under the Indian Act will give you $80. And I didn't like the idea of going around to ask for money for that remaining $20, whether I was talking about renovating my rec center or trying to build a youth program or trying to build an elders program. So I decided to go full on and going towards economic development. And it worked because our people became independent at the same time.
Now, so your community in Kitimat, around Kitimat, the Haisla First Nation, you would be something between a provincial government and a municipal government in terms of services that you were delivering. What was it that made you say, you know what, we got to get behind these LNG projects and these other resource development projects?
It wasn't me, actually. It was our council. I actually opposed LNG in the beginning. I opposed forestry and mining. I opposed the aluminum smelter that was already there for 60 years. But one of my councillors told me that I really should look at our social issues before I make a decision. So I did. And I was shocked that the way I grew up as a young man on reserve looking for a job was how many First Nations experience all across Canada. And then along with all the social issues that get attached to poverty. So I slowly changed my approach. But what really galvanized it was when I saw the changes in people when they got a job, and we didn't have to develop programs for them anymore. They just wanted to do things on their own. They wanted to buy a house. They wanted to buy a van. They wanted to go on vacation. And so all I did when I became chief was saying, how can I duplicate that on a scale that affects everybody? How can I do that? Instead of this mismatch of different initiatives here and there.
So when you started out, you were more on the line of, well, look, we should get more because they owe us. And you moved to, well, hold on. We can be the masters of our own domain if we go this way.
Yeah. And it wasn't an overnight aha moment. It wasn't like that. I read the Indian Act. I read reports from all over Canada from First Nations. I read reports on poverty from all over the world. And I studied different governance systems. And I looked at extreme poverty. I looked at poverty in India, South America. I looked at poverty in the United States. And I could see the comparisons in terms of what we were facing. And so I broke away from the narrative of saying no to economic development, saying no to government, and started to really understand the connection of the rights to title case law under Section 35 and under the umbrella of a country like Canada. But it took at least a few years for me to put it all together.
So we're hearing a lot of voices who are opposed to economic development and resource development and resource extraction being amplified right now. I mean, this is everywhere. And one group that I point to is Coastal First Nations, which sounds like, well, it represents all the First Nations along the coast, but this is a specific group. They're a not-for-profit organization that has some representation of First Nations groups along the coast, but not all. But we keep hearing that group say there will be no pipeline. We will not allow this. We are all opposed to it. You know, I've looked into these guys, Ellis, and first off, it started out as a group called the Great Bear Initiative Society, funded by American foundations, and American foundations who have always been opposed to Canadian resource development, whether it's forestry, whether it's mining, whether it's oil and gas, and so they fund this group, and then this becomes here's the First Nations group that opposes it. What would be your message to people within First Nations communities specifically, Canadians writ large, but also specifically to people in First Nations communities who are looking at this and saying, well, I guess we should protect everything, right? Because that's the better way forward. I mean, you went on this journey yourself. What would your message be to someone who is leaning towards that?
We used to be part of that organization. I was actually on the executive at that time, and I understood where the money came from. It came from American foundations that you mentioned, like the Moore Foundation in the United States. But at that time, when I was a part of it, we were trying to get away from the idea that the David Suzuki Foundation would accept the funding and then forward it on to us. We were trying to make it as a direct link to ours, but we had no idea of the narrative out there that talking about American funders were actually opposing projects in BC and Canada. We had no idea. We just thought it was as a way, because you got to remember, First Nations don't have money.
So you saw it as a bunch of well-meaning organizations that wanted to fund.
Yep. And
But they
I
were
noticed,
funding for a specific reason to
yeah,
stop development.
and then that's one of the things that I didn't like is that these organizations knew that we didn't have any money, and so that was the motivating factor behind it. I mean, every one of us were trying to find a way forward for our people, and that's the thing that I want to tell people is that this wasn't uh, an exercise to glorify myself, or I didn't want any of that. I just wanted the future First Nations not to go through what I went through, looking for a job, welfare, unemployment insurance, that cycle over and over and over. So I measure a success on whether or not an individual First Nation can basically uh, fend for themselves in the 21st century. That's my measurement. Everything else I think is it's good, it's positive if everything gets affected, but if you don't put the people first in terms of them successful, then I have no interest in being involved in any of that.
What we're talking about now, though, with this memorandum of understanding from between the federal government and the province of Alberta, is that there needs to be Indigenous equity ownership. And I was at a speech recently with given by Francois Poirier, the CEO of TC Energy. They could be one of the proponents for the pipeline. I'm sure you'd hear a similar language from uh, Greg, I believe it's Greg Eber from Enbridge. Everyone's talking about Indigenous equity ownership and partnerships. And so if the pipeline goes through your land, you're going to benefit. Do you take that as a positive step forward, or is it tokenism?
No, that term has been kicked around for the last 15 years at least, but it wasn't characterized as equity. It's characterized in the court ruling, the Haida court ruling, as accommodation. And the specific clause says that there's an economic component of rights and title that must be addressed. But that's it. It's just that general heading. So you can insert anything that you want into that heading that speaks about economics. And the equity thing is for first. Tell you what, I didn't like the idea of equity for my band, and I was chief. There's other bands that are ready for that step, that huge step.
Well,
I felt that my
why
band
didn't you
wasn't
like it?
ready.
Why wouldn't you want an ownership stake in something that's going to benefit you?
Well, it would have benefited me, but I would have had to go out and find financing, and I would have had to borrow money, and I would have had to pay it back, and I would have had to pay interest on that loan. And I didn't feel that my people truly understood that. And so, say if I got 10% in a pipeline, I was trying to explain, it's not like you can start getting cash hand over fist right away. There's a lot of expenses that got to be paid first, and then you get paid out at a later date. There's a responsibility attached to that, and you got to define where your liability ends. I mean, I just thought at a future date, I thought we're ready for equity, and specifically where I thought we'd be ready for it was Haisla Cedar LNG. That's why we incorporated that into our agreement with LNG Canada. But
And so you
there were
feel
so
they're
many
ready.
things that
You feel they're
if
ready
I couldn't
now.
understand it, if I couldn't understand the issues, I didn't feel comfortable giving it to my community to understand it.
But do you feel ready now for your community and others in the area?
Yeah, I think now we are because we engaged with Chevron in their multi-billion-dollar project. We engaged with LNG Canada.
Mm-hmm.
We engaged with Rio Tinto Alcan, the aluminum smelter. I mean, we've been exposed to the business world. We've been exposed to the bigger world. And I don't know about the councils of today, but over the time I was there, it was almost on a daily basis we're learning something new about the economics and the business world. So it was a slow progression, but the results speak for themselves. And I think our band, with more educated people getting into our leadership, I think they're more ready to accept and understand the principles behind equity.
So you went from being councillor to chief to MLA to MP. Been looking at some of what you've been saying in the House of Commons, and you're still being supportive of this. I know that one of your colleagues, former Chief Billy Moran, he was at Premier Smith's announcement. What's your take on her announcement where she was talking about the memorandum of understanding? What's your take on the MOU and the possibility of greater resource development and pipeline going to BC's northwest coast?
Well, we signed a lot of MOUs back in my day as chief counselor, and it's basically a promise to talk about something in the future. There's no real definition of what that MOU is actually saying. I mean, there's a lot in that MOU. There is a lot, and it's not just about a
It's more
pipeline.
detailed than I'm used to in an MOU, which is part of why I was very skeptical before it came out. And I got to say, I was much more heartened after I saw it because it went, okay, well, there's at least some meat here. Yeah, you got to go through some hoops, but I'm hopeful that we can get to a pipeline. I know there's no date attached to exactly when construction starts and all of that, but a lot of MOUs are just, well, vague language of aspirational goals to one day talk about maybe potentially doing something.
Yeah, I agree. But really, this MOU is the same way. Like you do mention that you had to build a nuclear plant, a functioning nuclear plant by 2050. But the other stuff is kind of vague. You got to help BC develop an economic plan. You got to help BC with their electricity needs. There's a number, like no other proponent that I've ever seen has had to commit to these types of provisions that doesn't really have anything to do with their project. Now I understand it's a government to government basically MOU, but I still say the real initiative will start when an application is made to Canada, the Impact Assessment Agency, and Canada's decision whether or not they transfer that to the Major Projects Office. I mean, I think, like even an application that I've seen over the years to Canada or BC is not really fully complete. There's some blanks. And normally Canada and BC will accept those applications. So, but I think we'll get a better idea of what this all means when the application is made.
Do you believe that there will be or should be a private sector company come forward on this? Do you believe that a pipeline to the northwest coast should go ahead?
Yes, I believe it should be in the private sector hands. Trans Mountain was a nightmare of cost overruns and hypocrisy. I don't think the government is truly sincere in trying to get something done based on what their rhetoric, and that rhetoric still stands today. We heard the minister say that what we're talking about here in terms of the MOU has never been done before. Well, yeah, it has. The Trans Mountain Pipeline is an example. The LNG Canada Pipeline is an example. The certificate for Chevron's project is alive and well and waiting for some other proponent to come along. And in those cases, both levels of government never said that they needed 100% consensus from 100% of the First Nations, and they still approved and built their projects. So there's a lot of politics in this yet.
Okay, so we talked earlier about the fact that there is no veto for an individual band, but what should be done? You said earlier that you studied closely rights and title. That's a big discussion, especially after Cowichan. But as it relates to a pipeline and a resource project, what is the threshold? I mean, we saw during Northern Gateway that there were 31 bands along the route that supported it, and there were people that opposed it. Coastal First Nations, that not-for-profit, not all of the Coastal First Nations, but that not-for-profit based in downtown Vancouver, they opposed it, and Art Starrett, who was their leader at the time, said if they put even a shovel in the ground, we'll be there to stop them. who speaks for who, and what is the threshold for saying you've got to have buy-in and consultation?
Well, that's the thing, is that Canadians don't understand who holds rights and title. And if you look at the court cases, it's
Well, in
actually,
BC, because there's no treaties, I think that's up in the air between different First Nations groups as well. What was the stat I heard one time? 120% of BC is claimed because it's not settled.
oh yeah, well, then that's a different issue altogether. But the idea that somehow these representative groups represent rights and title is wrong. They don't represent rights and title. It's actually, the rights and title is held on behalf of the community. So my First Nation, for example, Haisla, the community actually owns the rights and title. So it only stands to reason the community's got to decide who represents us in this equation. And for us, it was the elected council. But every community's got to answer that question. But to say that somebody owns the rights and title, whether it be an individual or maybe a representative group, no, that's not right. And so when it comes down to it, if there's a consultation and accommodation process ever initiated by Canada and BC, then they've got to go talk to the community themselves and find out exactly what they want and how they want to address their rights and title interests.
Well, I can just imagine after the vote where you got 92% in favor of the LNG project, that CBC would show up and do an in-depth profile on the 8% that said no, rather than the 92% that said yes. And they would say, see, not everyone agrees, and that's part of the problem. And then you've got some groups, and I know, so I'm in Southern Ontario. This is where I was born and raised, used to know Six Nations out by Oshweek fairly well. They've now got the issue of elected band and council, elected chiefs, and hereditary chiefs. I know that's a problem with some in British Columbia. That was part of the problem with Coastal GasLink, was people showing up and saying, well, yeah, the band approved it, but I'm the hereditary chief, and I say no. How's the government, any government, supposed to deal with that?
They can't. And the government, I mean, you can't lay the blame at government's feet for this. Because a lot of people don't understand First Nations and their leadership structures. And I never said either way, whether or not it's hereditary leadership or elected leadership that should represent rights and title. What I said was it's up to the community to decide who represents them. And I've never seen any type of referendum from any community to talk about that fundamental issue. But when I do go to First Nations and talk to some of the people, and they talk about their unemployment, their poverty, their suicide rate, that's one of the things I ask is, so, who represents you? Like, if there's a project coming down the pike, who represents you? And do you guys have an idea of what you want? Because it's really not up to leadership to decide what the people want. A good leader will take everything into consideration from their own community, and it's not going to be it's not going to be consensus. It's probably going to be a majority, and try to translate that into a plan. And I had to learn this the hard way.
You're a different party than Premier David Eby, a different party than Prime Minister Carney, obviously also a different party than Alberta Premier Danielle Smith. But if you were advising all of them on how to approach this going forward in terms of consultations with First Nations groups, in terms of getting people on side, what's your advice for these three elected leaders?
Well, I think Premier Smith is doing a good job. She's not really imposing anything. She's talking to First Nations through her ministers, and she's trying to develop a process to kind of get into BC and understand the issues. Premier Eby has always opposed everything, regardless. And if you outright oppose, then the policies that been put in place by the NDP have actually restricted resource development, like mining, for instance.
John Horgan, the late John Horgan, referred to people like David Eby as part of the Mud Hut Brigade of his party. They've always been opposed to everything. Horgan could accept a certain degree of resource development, and he's an old blue collar guy, but he referred to guys like Eby as the Mud Hut Brigade.
Think about, like, the NDP opposed LNG, right? And then it became the government. They gave him a PST tax break and a cap on the carbon tax. But what really impressed me about John Horgan was when they approved it, he never hesitated to point me out as being one of the architects of LNG. Like, that was impressive. As a political leader, he really impressed me with that. But the advice I'd give to Prime Minister Carney is stop flip-flopping on what you're saying to First Nations, given what day it is or where you are. One day you say you'll only do it with consensus or national consensus. The next day you'll say there's no veto. Then you'll go back to consensus. And I mean, the consensus word is in the case law. It's there, but only in certain situations. But the case law is pretty explicit. There's no veto. And so, the Liberals dancing around this term of consensus, it's doing a disservice to Canadians, and it's doing a disservice to First Nations alike. And it's not going to get us to be the best performing country in the G7. It's not going to get us to be an energy superpower. And it's not going to get us away from the tariffs that President Trump is imposing us. So pick an idea, pick a statement. What is it? Is it consensus? Is it veto? Is it what is it?
Well, it's interesting you've picked up that the Liberals have about 5 different lines, depending on who they're talking to. Ellis, thanks so much for the time. Great talking to you again. We'll do it sooner rather than later next time.
Thank you very much.
Full Comment is a post-media podcast. My name's Brian Lilly, your host. This episode was produced by Andre Prue, theme music by Bryce Hall. Kevin Libin is the executive producer. Make sure that you leave us a comment, help us out with a subscription or a review, and let your friends know all about us. Until next time, I'm Brian Lilly.
Here's that clip from Canada Did What? I Promised You. But the late 1960s, you have members of the Montreal Police who can spend their entire shift rushing from one FLQ bombing to another. Here's how New Year's Eve 1968 played out for Robert Cote, a member of the Montreal Police bomb squad, which put him at the forefront of fighting the FLQ during this period. He was supposed to be at home with his wife, who had just miscarried twin daughters. But instead, at 11 p.m., he's called out to Montreal City Hall to investigate a bomb that had just gone off. He's en route with sirens blaring when he's told, actually, don't bother with the exploded bomb. There's an unexploded bomb on the other side of City Hall you have to defuse. And then, right after snipping the wires on the City Hall bomb, Cote has to speed west where a third bomb has just exploded outside a federal building.
The bombing started in April and May of 1963. That's when the first bombings took place. And the mailbox bombings were the most famous part of the whole thing, which was basically on the Thursday night and Friday night leading into the Victoria Day weekend in 1963. So, and initially they started attacking these symbols of federalism, federal institutions, whether it was the Montreal Post Office or Revenue Canada. But the bombings escalated as time went on in terms of the size of the bombs and the powerfulness of these bombs.
If you want to hear the rest of the story, make sure you subscribe to Canada Did What? Everywhere you get your podcasts.